Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 13th of May of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the situation on the ground, because we see that the situation for the Ukrainians is critical. The Russians are advancing along the entire line of combat contact, and sometimes I think that the Ukrainian defense is about to collapse. Not just somewhere in the vicinity of the settlement of Bohatyr or somewhere in the Liman direction. It seems that the entire Ukrainian front line from the settlement of Orekhov to the city of Kupinsk can collapse any moment. Now let's discuss this situation in details, and first let's talk about the South Donetsk direction where the Russians continue offensive operation. I'll remind you that before the beginning of May ceasefire, this direction had probably the biggest and the fastest dynamic ever. The Russians were attacking and advancing in the direction of Zelene Polya from the settlement of Velika Novoselka along 0510 Road, and the Russians before the beginning of the ceasefire managed to almost answer these two settlements. As for the previous 24 hours, according to several mappers and according to several geolocations, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the northeast of the settlement of Zelene Polya. So this is the video we are talking about. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking and after withdrawing Russian soldiers and Russian units in this area that were trying to outflank the settlement of Zelene Polya from the northeast. This episode was geolocated on the map, and this is exactly the area where Ukrainians were trying to attack Russians. So now we see that currently the Russians are trying to continue advancing in the western direction with the purpose to cut the settlement of Zelene Polya from supply and support. Furthermore, most likely from these positions the Russians are planning to attack further in the northern direction with the purpose to outflank and to cut in cauldron Ukrainians on the territory of Volne Polya, and probably to force the Ukrainians from the settlements of Shevchenka and Volne Polya to fall back further in the northwestern direction. We see that despite Ukraine attempts to stabilize the situation, they still haven't managed to do this. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, about the Bohatyr, the settlement of Bohatyr. We have lots of icons in this area, as you can see, and today we had more and more resources, mainly pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian resources, that confirmed almost complete control over the settlement by the name of Bohatyr. We have several articles and several map changes that were published both by neutral and pro-Russian resources, and one more or less very reliable resource from the Russian side adjusted their map completely, showing the settlement of Bohatyr and the complete Russian control. The sources reported that today there were very heavy clashes, and later we got additional details from those who has connections with the situation on the ground. And today, probably by the end of the 13th of May of 2025, we had several reports that currently Ukrainians control one or two streets in the most northwestern and the northeastern parts of the settlement of Bohatyr. And according to information we have, most likely today, this upcoming night, the Russians will establish complete control over this territory, and most likely tomorrow the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information. Obviously we see that the Russians are trying to intensify their offensive activities right before the beginning of talks that are going to take place on the 15th of May of 2025. The Russians are trying to get as strong as possible positions before these negotiations. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense to the south of the settlement of Odradne and to the southeast of the settlement of Kamar. We expect that due to the critical situation in the area of Bohatyr, the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back from the area of Odradne as well in the northwestern direction. Basically, the settlement of Odradne is a very small settlement. And today pro-Russian resources published this video where we can see how Russian drones were flying above this village and how the Russians were dropping additional lists with a proposal to the armed forces of Ukraine to surrender or probably to fall back from this area. Most likely during this upcoming night between the 13th and the 14th of May of 2025, the armed forces of the Russian Federation will make first attempts to get as close as possible to the settlement or even to take under complete control this area area and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Once again, according to several pro-Russian very reliable resources, the armored forces of the Russian Federation managed to shorten the distance to the village of Kamar. This is probably the most important village in this area, or the next important village after the fall of the settlements of Alexeyevka and Bohatyr. If the Russians can answer the village of Kamar, this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in this area, and after this progress, most likely the Ukrainians would not be able to stop or to slow down the Russians until the settlements of Andreevka, Klitsova, Zelený Gai, Ivanovka and Gavrilovka. So this territory between these villages and this territory would be taken by the Russians within 2 or 3 weeks or something like this. Now let's talk about the Dnipro direction or Novopavlovka direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions. The several mappers reported that during the previous night, the Russians managed to improve their positions between Novoalexandrievka, Novosergeyevka. So this information was confirmed by pro-Russian resources and by neutral mappers. So once again, the Russians took under control all these villages, and the Russians, according to several sources, managed to answer the eastern outskirts of Novonikolaevka. We have very important video that was published by the Ukrainian sources from the 59th Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking these farms. Several sources reported that Ukrainians were bombing and attacking positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in the eastern part of the settlement, but later several units from the 59th Brigade gave us additional details about these strikes. The Ukrainians reported that they decided, or the Ukrainian commanders decided, to leave this territory, to abandon these positions, and now the Ukrainians are focused on destroying all farms, strongholds, possible positions which the Russians can use in the future with the purpose to concentrate and to accumulate forces. So Ukrainians, according to this video, decided to fall back from this area, and now the Ukrainians are trying to destroy as many as possible constructions and facilities on the territories of the villages of Muravka and Novonikolaevka, with the purpose not to allow the Russians to concentrate their units there, with the purpose to advance further in the direction of Novopavlovka. So this is what the Ukrainians are doing right now, and this is obviously an act of desperate, because this is the first time I see this situation. We haven't received even a single report that can confirm either the Russian presence on the territory of these villages, or that the Russians managed to get these territories and the Ukrainians decided to destroy these buildings already. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation around the Pokrovsk agglomeration. The situation for the Ukrainians in this area is critical, because the Russians, according to geolocations and according to updates we got during the previous 24 hours, managed to cut this Pokrovsk agglomeration in pincers. Let's discuss and we'll start with the southwestern direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continued their attempts to answer the southwestern part of the agglomeration. But the thing is that the Russians are not going to continue offensive operation further deep inside of the city itself. The Russians are trying to stick as close as possible to the settlement, but to outflank this city and this agglomeration from the west and from the east. In this video, we can see how Russians destroyed another temporary deployment point and ammo depot of the armored forces of Ukraine in the southwestern direction. Furthermore, according to several mappers, the Russians improved their positions in the Pokrovsk agglomeration already on the territory of the settlement by the name of Zverova. So these are the changes on the ground in this area. So once again, the Russians will try to take some streets or maybe some constructions in the southwestern part of the city of Pokrovsk, but most likely with the purpose to create a stable and strong flank position. Most likely in the very near future, the Russians will resume their attempts to attack further in the northern direction with the purpose to cut N32 Road and to take under control the part of the railways between the settlement of Sergeyevka and the city of Pokrovsk itself. So most likely this is going to be the primary task and the primary target for the armed forces of the Russian Federation during this summer or early summer military campaign. Why is that? Because the Russians shown significant results on the eastern flank of the city of Pokrovsk. We are talking about the settlements of Malininovka, Mirolubovka and Mikhailovka. I'll remind you that yesterday we adjusted the map in the vicinity of this reservoir. The Ukrainian sources published this video where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russian soldiers and Russian units on the territory along this reservoir with FPV drones. In this video we can see Russian soldiers that were moving along the dam, so we have no doubts that the Russians managed to cross the river of Zhuravka and Kazenny Torets and to take under control positions on the Ukrainian side of these water barriers. And today, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation made another statement and published another report, and according to this report, the armed forces of the Russian Federation, more precisely the units of the Group of Forces Center, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Mirolubovka. So this village was taken by the Russians by the end of the 13th of May of 2025. Once again, this is the situation by the end of the 11th of May of 2025. This is the situation by the end of the 12th of May of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 13th of May of 2025. That was very important stronghold and very important defense layer of the entire Pokrovsk defense system, and these positions were taken by the Russians. Now the Russians have no barriers to continue advancing further in the western direction and of course in the northwestern direction with the purpose to attack the settlement of Novaya Kinamichne, which is most likely going to be the next target for the Russians. Another important update we got today from the settlement of Malininovka. Once again, right before I pressed the record button and began making this video, several pro-Russian resources published another proof, several geolocations from the area of Malininovka, how Russian soldiers were raising their flag in different parts of the settlement. So according to this video that we haven't managed to add to the map, we will adjust the map tomorrow and before the next, let's say, video, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over this territory. So obviously this is very huge and very important progress of the armed force of the Russian Federation in the entire battle for the city and for the Pokrovsk agglomeration. And according to several military experts, the Russians are planning to advance further in the northwestern direction with the purpose to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Novaya Kinamichne. So this is approximately the plan and the target of the Russian forces, to outflank the Pokrovsk agglomeration from the west and to outflank this agglomeration from the east. From these two positions, the Russians would be able to establish complete control over the northern roads that Ukrainians used to supply and support the settlement. This is going to be the biggest cauldron ever since the beginning of the special military operation, and the Russians, as we can see, are trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back without showing any resistance on the territory of this agglomeration. Most likely the Russians are trying to take this settlement probably with minimal damage, because the Russians understand that after signing of any peace agreement, and most likely this agreement is going to be signed sooner or later, the Russians are trying to save this city with the purpose to allow people to populate this area in the future and to restore this area back to normal life. So, and obviously the Russians will do everything they can with the purpose to get this, to achieve this. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing along the N32 Road, and today several mappers reported that the Russians managed to take this pocket between these reservoirs. This territory was taken by the Russians, including very huge company stronghold in the middle. So we see that the Russians continue advancing, and most likely the Russians are going to continue offensive operation along N32 Road in the direction of the city of Konstantinovka from the southwest. This is going to be obviously unexpected for the Ukrainians. And telling the truth, I have some doubts whether the Ukrainians are able to battle and to carry out at the same time several defense operations, because obviously the main point and the main target of the Russians, not to create another Bakhmut, not to create another Avdiivka, not to create another Mariupol. The Russians are going to create multiple Bakhmuts, multiple Avdiivkas, and multiple probably Mariupols. The Russians want to test whether the Ukrainians are able to hold their lines and to hold their defense when they have not just one Bakhmut, but let's say 3 or 4 Bakhmuts at the same time. And we are talking about, of course, the Battle of Pokrovsk, the Battle of Konstantinovka, the Battle of Siversk, and the Battle of Liman at the same time. So most likely all these settlements the Russians are going to attack at the same time, and the Russians are trying to understand and to see whether the Ukrainians have enough of forces to hold their lines along every single city, every single settlement we've just discussed. The Russians, as I understand, believe, and they most likely understand that Ukrainians doesn't have such possibilities. When talking about these Kleban-Byksky pocket during the previous 24 hours, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to cut this salient. Most likely the Ukrainians decided to fall back from this area due to high risk of being encircled by the Russian forces. As for now, this territory is marked as a contested area according to pro-Ukrainian sources, but we believe that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow we're going to receive additional updates and we will color this territory completely. As for the city of Tesk, there are still very heavy clashes, and we continue adjusting the map both in Russian and in Ukrainian favor. As for the northern part, we have this video where we can see how Ukrainians managed to establish control once again over the elevation and over this Terikon, and how Ukrainians were trying to hide themselves under the fire of Russian artillery and FPV drones. Furthermore, we have several reports that Ukrainians managed to restore completely this part of the city of Tesk and Tesk agglomeration, including this mine. We will adjust and we'll discuss the situation tomorrow. Furthermore, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of the Zabalka district, and the Russians continue offensive operation further in the direction of the settlements of Sherbenovka and Novospaskaya. According to information we have, the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of the southern Delivka. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the city of Chesaviar. Once again, today we got several statements and several articles. According to them, the Russians managed to take under control the central part of the city of Tesk. As for now, we are waiting for additional geolocations, but most likely before the next video we're gonna get additional map changes from different sources, or maybe we're gonna receive several icons or several videos that will confirm this. So once again, several sources reported that the central part of the city of Chesaviar was taken by the Russians today by the end of the 13th of May of 2025. As for the Siversk direction, we have lots of icons in this area, as you can see, and based on these icons we came to the conclusion that most likely the Russians are about to begin another major offensive operation with the purpose to take under complete control over the settlements of Tarskoye, Grigorovka, and most likely the Russians are planning to get this village of Verkhnekamenskaya and Serebryanka also under complete fire or under complete physical control. And according to these geolocations and according to the geography of these geolocations, we expect that the Russians are planning to begin or to develop their offensive from the settlements of Dibrova and Kremina in the southern direction. First, the Russians, as we see, are trying and are planning to take under control this huge Serebryanka forest. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians were bombing the settlement of Yampol. And we expect that during the next several days or even hours, the Russians will attack using these roads of attacks. And as for now, they need to take under control the settlement of Tarskoye. This will allow the Russians to begin their offensive operation in the direction of Liman. Because according to information we have, it's time to begin this offensive due to a very complicated situation on the village, in the area of the village of Kadup. The Russians published a lot of videos today and a lot of geolocations from this area. First of all, the village of Kadup is about to be reduced to ruins under very heavy fire of Russian units and Russian artillery forces. Furthermore, several geolocations that were published during the previous 24 hours confirmed a strong Russian presence in the most eastern part of the settlement. Most likely this video is archived. I'm trying to tell you that most likely this video was made 2 or 3 days ago. So we expect that by the end of the 13th of May of 2025, the Russians have improved their position significantly. Most likely currently the clashes are taking place for the most western part of the village. As we discussed in the previous videos and previous updates, now the Russians are trying to establish complete control over this territory. This will allow the Russians to continue offensive operation in the direction of Liman from the northwestern direction and of course from the eastern direction. So this is the situation in this area. Once again, Russia's plan is to begin several Bakhmut offensive operations or several Mariupol assault operation, and to test and to see whether the Ukrainians are able to hold their positions in many towns and cities, or the Ukrainian lines would collapse automatically. This is the question that the Russians are trying to find answer. As for the northern directions, during the previous 24 hours, we got additional updates from the area of Yunakivka. Several videos were published by the Ukrainian sources where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking with drones Russian positions in the southern part of Belavody. In this video, we can see several attacks on Russian positions in this part of the village, and based on this video, we have adjusted the map, the settlement of Belavody completely in the Russian favor. So this is the situation in this area, and we expect that most likely the group of forces north, either the group of forces north or the probably the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, will confirm control over this territory. The Russians continue advancing in the southern direction with the purpose to outflank the settlement of Yunakivka and to attack Ukrainian positions from behind along N32 Road. So the situation in this area is getting worse and worse, obviously. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.